Indian poetry in English in the post-independence period is totally different from what it was in the pre-independence period. It is not just the change in the time or in the nomenclature, that is pre-independence to post-independence, that matters. The style of writing, the themes selected by the poets, and the way of presentation, and the very outlook of the poets who wrote during this period reveals drastic transformation. And this is because the poets belonging to the post-independence period came under the influence of a totally different group of poets like modernists. But it will be very reductive to argue that it is the influence of modernism that transformed the style of writing of the post-independence Indian poets. We will have to look at the broad socio-political context of India at that time. Some of the important poets during this period are Nazim Ezekiel, Kamala Das, Jayanta Mahapatra, R. Parthasarathi, Jeev Patel, A.K. Ramanujan, K.K. and Daruwala, etc. So when we look at the poems written by almost all these poets, we find that they adopt a style that is different from the pre-independence poets. In the case of Nazim Ezekiel, we find a kind of irony that is prevalent in almost all poems written by Ezekiel. One of the most famous poems written by Ezekiel was The Night of the Scorpion. It has been included in almost all anthologies of Indian poetry in English. The Night of the Scorpion speaks about an ordinary experience in an Indian village. In the poem The Night of the Scorpion, the poet describes an ordinary experience that happens in an Indian village. A scorpion enters into a house in a rainy night and picks on the mother. We find people running here and there in search of the scorpion. And the poet says, we find the shadows of the scorpion on the wall, because these people are carrying a lantern. Actually, it is the shadows of these people that are seen on the wall, but that appears to be that of the scorpion. So the poet is ironically suggesting that the evil, that is the poison, is within these people. They are chanting mantras, they are using all kinds of magical charms to keep away the poison that has entered into the body of the mother. But it was of no use. Even the father, who was a skeptic, is trying to use mantras and all kinds of traditional practices for removing the poison from the body of the mother. But the poet also says that nobody cared about the pain, the suffering that the woman undergoes. After some time, she was relieved. That means after 24 hours, she was relieved of the pain. The poison lost its impact and she was relieved. So this poem, even though it appears to be a humorous poem, ironic poem, it also speaks about the Indian society, which fails to understand the real issues that we face. We are always after false issues. We fight for the false issues. We try to understand our problems in a totally unrealistic fashion, Here in this poem, the real issue is the pain of the mother, the poison that has entered into the body of the mother. Instead of using a medicine, they are all chanting mantras, and they say that the suffering of the mother in this life will lessen the sin in the next life. That is a kind of mantra that they recite. That is a kind of attitude that the people show. So the kind of superstition and the inability, the very inability to understand the reality of life, and that is mocked at in this poem. So Ezekiel is highly ironic, and this is because he says in one of his autobiographical poems, Background Casually, in that poem he says that he doesn't belong to India. He has no affinity for India. He has no love for Indians, Indian way of life. He hates India, but he happened to be in India. The background place is where I am. That is what he says in the poem. My background place is where I am. I belong to India. I happen to be born in India, so I live in India. That is the only kind of relationship that he has for India. So Ezekiel belongs to a Jewish family. His forefathers came to India in the 19th century. They settled in India, and so he happened to be born and brought up in India. He is highly critical of Indians. While studying in school, he was ill-treated by both Hindus and Muslims and Christians, and we find that he was alienated to a great extent in the Indian society. So his poetry is an attempt to come to terms with the Indian reality. That is why he writes poetry. So Ezekiel is a representative post-independence Indian poet who is highly critical of the contemporary Indian society. And when we come across the other poets like A.K. Ramanujan, for example, or Kamala Das, for example, they are all critical of the contemporary life. In the case of Kamala Das, what we find is a strong reaction to the kind of male-dominated society that is very much evident in her poetry. But I would say that Kamala Das is one poet who was highly misunderstood by readers as well as critics. Kamala Das is considered to be a poet who openly speaks about her experiences. That is one of the comments or one of the arguments put forward by critics. She openly speaks about her experiences, unlike many Indian women. That is why her poetry gets acceptance all over the world. Another thing is that she is a nymphomaniac. Vrinda Nabar, a famous critic, wrote a book about Kamala Das, and in that she presents her as a nymphomaniac. But I think the real Kamala Das is different from both these interpretations. In Kamala Das, what we find, in her poetry at least, what we find is the absence of love. She is always writing about the absence of love, lack of love. And it is the absence of love that results in alienation. She feels alienated in life. For example, in Freaks, the poem that she writes, Freaks, she is criticizing the male lovers that she has. She says man is incapable of loving. Man with nimble fingertips can unleash nothing more alive than the skin's lazy hungers. That is what she writes. Man with his nimble fingertips can unleash nothing more relief than the skin's lazy hungers. So man is capable of physical love, not the real kind of love that a woman desires for. And it is this absence of love that leads to alienation. The Sunshine Cat is another poem that speaks about the experience of alienation. Same experiences are present in many other poems. Alienation. In Sunshine Cat, she speaks about the way in which her experience of being shut down in a room alone, her husband going out for days together. So like a sunshine cat, she is inside the room alone, and when her husband returns, she is frozen, so frozen that she cannot make love. So the experience of alienation is very powerfully presented in poems like this. And this experience of alienation results in nostalgia. The nostalgic memories of her Tharavod in Nalapad, in Malabar, is evident in a poem, My Grandmother's House, which describes her experience in the grandmother's house, where she was loved, cared, taken care of, where she has enough company of people who loves her. So when we look at Kamala Das's poetry, there are three important themes that recurs. One is absence of love, second is alienation, third is nostalgia. All the three are related. Absence of love generates alienation, alienation results in nostalgia. So Kamala Das tried to open up a new way of writing. She doesn't care about the lines or the metrical virtuosity of her lines. What she writes in her famous poem Introduction is that she tries to unburden her experiences as it is, without any kind of control. She has no control over her poetry, unburdening it as it comes to her mind, as it is, without any change. That is what she writes. That is the way in which she writes. So Kamala Das's poetry is different from the poems of Nazim Ezekiel. It is totally different from Nazim Ezekiel's poetry, because whereas Nazim Ezekiel is very much sensitive to the style of writing, the metrical virtuosity of his poetry, Kamala Das is least interested in that. And then when we come to other poets like A.K. Ramanujan, for example, we find that the style is even different in Ramanujan. Ramanujan writes in an imagistic style, we can say. His poems are image-oriented poems. He speaks through images. When we say that he speaks through images, we find that Ramanujan presents a series of images, and it is the images that speaks for him. The famous poem A River, written based on the Vaigai river of Madurai, he speaks about the two different times, the past and the present. He says that in the past, poets wrote poems about this particular river which is in flood, which is full of water, which was extremely beautiful. But now what is the condition of the river? There is no water. Water trickles down, and there are small ponds created within the river. There is no river as such. Water is not flowing, only few ponds here and there, and buffaloes are bathing in that ponds. So that poem is full of repulsive images. repulsive images like hair clogging in the water gate, and the buffalo's bodies glistening in the sun. All these are highly repulsive images that creates a kind of repulsion in the mind of the readers. And he also refers to another image, that is the sand ribs, the sands in the river. There is no water, the sands form a kind of rib-like structure. So the ribs, the projected ribs, is certainly an indication of poverty. So the poverty, the drought, and the total repulsive atmosphere in the present is contrasted with the past. He also ironically looks at the attitude of the people. People are not interested in the river or in the poverty of the people. They are interested in the river only when the water rises during the floods, the rising water, which takes away the buffaloes, the cows, certain people die during floods, and that becomes a news. So we find in Ramanujan a totally different style, which speaks about the contemporary decadence of India. So in all the three poets, we come across a kind of dejection or a kind of disillusionment with the contemporary Indian life. It is this disillusionment that is there in the basis of the attitude of the post-independence poet. Why this disillusionment? When we look at the socio-political context, we can think that independence was one of the biggest aims of the pre-independence society. They believed that after independence everything will be okay. India will develop into a very progressive nation. We will be able to eradicate poverty. We will be able to attend the problems of the people, and we will be able to develop into a modern society. But after independence, it was clear that our problems could not be solved easily, or the governments that came after independence did not succeed in solving our problems, in resolving the issues, and that naturally created a kind of dejection, a kind of disillusionment. So the creative source of poetry in the post-independence period is certainly this dejection and disillusionment. It is from this disillusionment that the poetry, not only poetry, the other kinds of writings emerge in the post-independence period. And when we compare the modernist tradition in the West and the kind of poetry in the post-independence period in India, we can say that there are certain similarities. It will be wrong to say that the poetry in the Indian context in the post-independence period is an imitation of the modernist movement in the West. There are certain similar styles, similar techniques used by poets, but in India we have a context in which the hopelessness, despair, and the kind of anguish that we find in modern poetry emerges. Indian context was to a great extent congenial for the growth of these kinds of emotions at that time. So the post-independence Indian poetry, we can say, is at the same time influenced by the Western modernism and the disillusionment in the Indian socio-political context. And apart from these three poets, there were many other poets like R. Parthasarathi, who wrote about the East-West encounter, and how it influences the Indian psyche. Jayanta Mahapatra, who wrote about Indian villages, Indian women, etc. Mahapatra's style was also very much similar to Ramanujan's style as far as the use of images are concerned. K.K. and Daruvala also wrote about the contemporary Indian situation, and we find several such poets emerging. The 60s, the 70s were all rich with emergence of new Indian poets in English, and the publication houses of P. Lal actually helped many Indian poets to publish their first collection of poetry and to emerge as notable poets in the Indian context. It is true that the Indian poetry in English in the later stages could not develop further as a notable branch of literature, maybe because the novels began to acquire more attention in the later part. But even then, we find that poetry is being written now and it continues to be appreciated. Earlier, the Illustrated Weekly of India was one magazine that supported these poets by publishing poems. There were several such magazines that published Indian poetry in English. And we also find that Indian poets in other languages are trying to translate their poems into English. So, the Dalit poets who emerged in the recent period, some of these Dalit poetry is translated into English. So, in that way, if we can call all these things Indian poetry in English, Indian poetry in English is growing now with original writings in English as well as with translations from regional languages into English. I hope I made a survey of the Indian poetry in English in the post-independence period. Thank you very much for listening.